Dear colleagues, good evening. Let me say right away that I am standing here very nervous because I'm about to introduce a person who needs no additional introductions to you. When we were founding our initiative, Crimea SOS, it happened on the first day of the Russian occupation of the Crimea. We, as hundreds of other volunteers, were watching UN Security Council meeting at New York. It was probably the first time I ever learned of Samantha Power, Ambassador Samantha Power. Later on, I learned of her earlier positions in campaign of Barack Obama, of her Irish extraction, Irish roots that you can see in the presentations, in the speeches she makes. Never ever have before Ukrainians observed the Security Council meetings and the way she could address Russia's representative, Mr. Churkin. So I'm very happy to introduce to you Ambassador Samantha Power, U.S. Permanent Representative at the UN.
Добрий день. Thank you all so much for being here. As Tamila said, I represent the United States at the United Nations. The United Nations Security Council, the body whose job it is to address threats to international peace and security, has met 33 times to discuss the crisis in Ukraine since February 2014, when Russia's little green men first started appearing in Crimea. Many times more than it has met on any other crisis in the world during that period. The focus on Ukraine in the Security Council is important because it gives me the chance, on behalf of the United States, to lay out the mounting evidence of Russia's aggression, its obfuscation, and its outright lies. Or, as I told Russia's representative last week in an emergency Security Council meeting about the Russian separatist attacks on Marinka, quoting Kyiv's native son, Mikhail Bulgakov, quote, "The tongue can conceal the truth, but the eyes never," end quote. And America is clear-eyed when it comes to seeing the truth about Russia's destabilizing actions in your country. The message of the United States throughout this Moscow-manufactured conflict, and the message you heard from President Obama and other world leaders at last week's meeting of the G7, has never wavered. If Russia continues to disregard the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and if Russia continues to violate the rules upon which international peace and security rest, then the United States will continue to raise the costs on Russia. And we will continue to rally other countries to do the same, reminding them that their silence or inaction in the face of Russian aggression will not placate Moscow, it will only embolden it. But there is something more important that is often lost in the international discussion about Russia's effort to impose its will on Ukraine. And that is you, the people of Ukraine, and your right to determine the course of your own country's future. Far too often, people tell the story of what is happening today in Ukraine without you in it. It is East versus West, the Eurasian Union versus the European Union, Russia versus the EU, or Russia versus the United States. In this telling, at best, the Ukrainian people get to choose one of these sides. At worst, a side is chosen for you. As every Ukrainian knows, this dynamic, leaving the Ukrainian people out of the story of Ukraine, is not unique to recent events. The same can be said for long stretches of your nation's history. The irony of applying this way of thinking to the current crisis is that it goes against the very ethos of the Maidan, which was and still is about putting you, the Ukrainian people, back in the driver's seat of your country's future. It is about restoring your voice, a voice too often ignored by corrupt politicians, oligarchs, and foreign powers. Or, as one of the great rallying cries of the Maidan put it, Ukraina ponad use, Ukraine above all else. So today, I want to speak to your valiant struggle to reclaim that voice, why it brought people out to the Maidan in the first place, how it is being carried forward today in spite of daunting obstacles, and what must be done to ensure that the effort succeeds in building the sovereign, democratic Ukraine that you want and deserve. Let me begin with what we know brought people out to the Maidan in the first place. We've all heard a good number of myths about this. One, told by the Yanukovych government and its Russian backers at the time, was that the Maidan protesters were pawns of the West and did not speak for the real Ukraine. A more nefarious myth peddled by Moscow after Yanukovych's fall was that Euromaidan had been engineered by Western capitals in order to topple a democratically elected government. The facts tell a different story. As you remember well, then President Yanukovych abandoned Kyiv of his own accord, only hours after signing an agreement with opposition leaders that would have led to early elections and democratic reforms. And it was only after Yanukovych fled the capital that 328 of the 447 members of the democratically elected Rada voted to strip him of his powers, including 36 of the 38 members of his own party in parliament at the time. Yanukovych then vanished for several days, only to eventually reappear, little surprise, in Russia. As is often the case, these myths reveal more about the myth makers than they do about the truth. Moscow's fable was designed to airbrush the Ukrainian people and their genuine aspirations and demands out of the Maidan by claiming the movement was fueled by outsiders. Yet, as you all know, by living through it, and as was clear even to those of us watching your courageous stand from afar, the Maidan was made in Ukraine. A Ukraine of university students and veterans of the Afghan war, of Ukrainian, Russian, and Tatar speakers, of Christians, Muslims, and Jews. This very building where we are gathered today, the October Palace, became a shelter for protesters. More than 1,000 people slept here on any given night during the Euromaidan protests, in ornate rooms beneath classical paintings, on the floor of a ballet studio, and even under a grand concert piano. And on the steps leading up to this building, people stockpiled hundreds of heads of cabbage and other vegetables donated by farmers, and babushki cooked them up in vats, feeding piping hot soup to the protesters. What brought together such a diverse mix of Ukrainians and what made them hold their ground through months of bitter cold and repeated attacks by the Berkut was the Ukrainian people's frustration that their voices were once again being ignored by those in power. Their sense that the basic compact At the core of the democratic model, that leaders are accountable to their citizens, had been broken. The Ukrainian people had good reason to feel disempowered, which went much deeper than Yanukovych's decision on whether to enter into association with the European Union. The feeling was grounded in the deep systemic corruption that permeated virtually every facet of Ukrainian life. At the time of the protests, Ukraine ranked 144th out of 175 countries on Transparency International's corruption index, the lowest of any European country. The pillaging by Yanukovych and his cronies had left this country tens of billions of dollars in debt. Ukraine's Prosecutor General's office later estimated that between 2010 and 2014, Ukrainian officials stole a fifth of their country's output each year. Graft, the lack of transparency, and the concentration of power in the hands of a few oligarchs and power holders were decades in the making. Under the Soviet Union, the institutions that provide an essential check on abuses of power in democracies, such as a robust free press and an impartial judiciary, simply did not exist. So the Maidan was not just about reversing a cynical political decision or unseating a single kleptocratic government. Instead, it was about dismantling a generations-old system that kept producing rotten decisions, broken institutions, and corrupt leaders. And it was about replacing it with one that was accountable to the Ukrainian people. Now, if the Maidan of 2013 and 2014 was about claiming your right to a genuinely democratic government, the task before you in 2015 and beyond is implementing the reforms needed to achieve Ukraine's transformation. It is about moving from demanding change to actually making change. This is my second point. You are still living in the revolution, and delivering on its promise will require all the resilience, smarts, and compassion you can muster. Given the powerful interests that benefited from the corrupt system, achieving a full transformation was always going to be an uphill battle. And that was before Russian troops occupied Crimea, something the Kremlin denied at the time, but has since admitted. And it was before Russia began training, arming, bankrolling, and fighting alongside its separatist proxies in eastern Ukraine, something the Kremlin continues to deny. Suddenly, the Ukrainian people faced a battle on two fronts: combating corruption and overhauling broken institutions on the inside, while simultaneously defending against aggression and destabilization from the outside. I don't have to tell you the immense strain that these battles have placed upon you. You feel it in the young men and women, including some of your family members and friends who have volunteered or been drafted into the military. People who could be helping build up their nation, but instead are risking their lives to defend it against Russian aggression. 2 Ukrainian soldiers were killed in the last day and 13 more wounded. You feel it in the conflict's impact on your country's economy, as instability makes it harder for Ukrainian businesses to attract foreign investment, deepens inflation, and depresses families' wages. It is felt in the energy that elected leaders and civil society members are forced to dedicate to responding to the crises generated by the conflict, energy that could have been devoted to improving public services like education and healthcare. It is felt in the undercurrent of fear in cities like Kyiv, where citizens have been the victims of multiple bomb attacks, the most lethal of which killed 4 people, including 2 teenage boys, at a rally celebrating the first anniversary of Euromaidan. And the impact is felt most directly by the people living in the conflict zone. According to the UN, at least 6,350 people have been killed in the violence driven by Russia and the separatists, including 625 women and children. And an additional 1,460 people are missing, 15,775 people have been wounded, and an estimated 2 million people have been displaced by this conflict. And the real numbers of killed, missing, wounded, and displaced are likely higher, according to the UN, due to its limited access to areas controlled by the separatists. Now, it seems the Russian government's cynical calculation in fueling this aggression was that a new Ukrainian government and newly empowered Ukrainian civil society would be so consumed by the military threat to their nation and so burdened by its destabilizing effects that they would not be able to focus on carrying out the project of the Maidan. As the reforms stalled, Moscow's thinking went, you, the Ukrainian people, would grow disillusioned with the tremendous sacrifices you were being asked to make for so little progress. And eventually, you would give up and return another pawn of Moscow to power. Blackmail would work. You would trade your rightful sovereignty for greater calm. That was the bet. But the Kremlin made a very serious miscalculation. It underestimated your resilience and your willingness to unite to help your fellow citizens. And it underestimated your tenacious determination to fix a broken system. To understand what is meant by Ukrainian resilience, look at the workers at the Avdiivka coking plant, the largest in Europe. Avdiivka produces the fuel used to power steelmaking plants across Ukraine, plants that employ tens of thousands of Ukrainians. If its furnaces are shut off and cooled down, they crack and break, wrecking the plant's costly machinery. The plant, as you all know, is near the line of contact along which Russia and the separatists routinely violate the ceasefire agreed to at Minsk by launching attacks. Because the workers' journey to and from work is so dangerous, some 2,000 workers have taken to sleeping on the grounds of the plant. Since the conflict began, the Avdiivka plant has been hit by more than 200 rocket and artillery strikes, which have killed at least 5 of its workers and wounded many more. In a single attack by combined Russian separatist forces on May 24th, 70 projectiles hit the factory. But the workers managed to keep the plant running, suspending operations only briefly. Some workers manned their posts right through the mortar and rocket attacks. The plant's director told a reporter of the struggle to keep the plant running. He said, quote, "You can't wait until tomorrow. You can't wait until they stop shooting. We wait a few minutes and then we act to extinguish the fires, plug the gaps, replace power sources, and you keep going until you fix all the holes," end quote. That idea that you cannot wait until they stop shooting to put out the fires and to plug the gaps has defined the Ukrainian spirit throughout this conflict. To understand what is meant by Ukrainian solidarity, look at the countless civil society groups that have sprung up to respond to the massive humanitarian crisis produced by Russian aggression. Yesterday, I visited Vostok SOS, one of the groups assisting the displaced in Kyiv. The group started when a local businessman took in a few families who had been forced to flee the Donbass. Those few families quickly became a few dozen families, and then hundreds of families, who Vostok SOS has helped obtain access to shelter and vital services like schooling, medical care, and jobs. One mother told me how her husband and 2-year-old child were killed when their home near Debaltseve was shelled during a Russian separatist offensive in February. She and her 5 surviving children escaped in a van whose roof and doors had been blasted out by shelling, eventually arriving in Kyiv, in this van. While she and other families I met told heartbreaking accounts of loss, They also spoke of the humbling compassion shown to them by the people of your city, of people who, seeing their fellow citizens in need, open their homes, their classrooms, and their hearts, and welcome them in, plugging the gaps. The Kremlin also underestimated your resolve to see through the process you started on the Maidan, to build a system that answers to you, the Ukrainian people, rather than to the oligarchs or to Moscow. And it is your unflagging commitment to that process that has been the driving force behind the reforms that you are trying to achieve. A run through some of these efforts shows their genuine promise. In October 2014, Ukraine held the freest and fairest Rada election in the country's history. This allowed the Ukrainian people to vote into office many new officials, including a number of journalists, human rights defenders, and transparency advocates who had played key roles in the Maidan movement and who are now helping drive reform efforts from the inside, while many of you exert pressure from the outside. These new members of government, together with civil society, are pushing for greater transparency. This is the first year that every member of the Rada has publicly disclosed his or her income and assets. The Anti-Corruption Committee became the first to live stream its meetings, allowing people to watch its investigations in real time. The Ministry of Infrastructure and the Ministry of Ecology and Natural Resources have started publishing the contracts, tenders, and resource concessions that they award online, processes that in the past were completely opaque, making it easier to hatch corrupt deals. And the government has approved a public broadcasting law that creates a single unified national network, which is both publicly funded and independent, and whose supervisory board reserves a majority of its seats for representatives from civil society. The government has also started to chip away at some of the oligarchs' monopolies. Consider the energy sector. On April 9th, the government passed a law aimed at breaking up the massive state energy behemoth, Naftogaz, into separate firms and strengthening Ukraine's national energy regulator. That same month, the Prosecutor General's office brought lawsuits against key power companies, which were given away at rock-bottom prices during the Yanukovych years. A major reason these reforms have advanced is because of the continuing pressure placed on government by civil society, which has gone from claiming a place in the Maidan to demanding a seat at the policymaking table. The reanimation reform package is one example. Made up of more than 100 advocates, policy experts, and journalists, the group not only keeps a monthly scorecard on whether the government is fulfilling its reform commitments, but also helps come up with concrete proposals for how those commitments can actually be met. Another example is stopfake.org, a website run by volunteer journalists, academics, and fact-checkers that uncovers false news and propaganda in the press, as it did last year when it revealed that a photograph on multiple Russian political sites claiming to show a morgue filled with bodies in Slovyansk was in fact taken 5 years earlier in Mexico. This pressure from civil society has also resulted in less tolerance for corruption. Look at the case of Alexander Yershov, who was appointed in April as temporary head of Ukraine's traffic police, a post he used to hold in Kyiv. On May 19th, the media reported that Yershov owns an unreported 3-story villa in Kyiv, as well as a fleet of cars valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars, all on an official income last year of around $1,500 a month. Yershov handed in his resignation within hours of the story breaking. He was the 4th high-ranking police official to resign in recent months due to dogged press reporting. Now, of course, the reform process is in its early days. For every area of modest progress, there are many in which much more work is needed, and in which entrenched powers are succeeding in fending off change. Far too many of the reforms made on paper are not being carried out in practice. And no one can credibly claim that the colossal problems these reforms aim to fix, the monopolies of the oligarchs, the lack of transparency, the enduring corruption, have been adequately addressed. Public pressure may be forcing some crooked officials from office, but it hasn't yet resulted in them being effectively prosecuted. Investigations into serious crimes, such as the violence in the Maidan and in Odessa, have been sluggish, opaque, and marred by serious errors, suggesting not only a lack of competence, but also a lack of will to hold the perpetrators accountable. This brings me to my third and final point, which is how crucial it is that you, the Ukrainian people, stay engaged in the reform process. Because slow as the pace of change may feel, powerful as your foes may feel, and profound as the hardships may be, building a system of new rules will never depend on what your government does, but rather what you make it do and what you do yourselves. I know that this is easier said than done, especially when you are struggling to feed a family as wages drop and food prices shoot up, or when you are spending sleepless nights in a basement with no electricity because of relentless shelling. And I know that for most people, the daily struggle to live with dignity may feel very similar to the way it did in the past, or perhaps even worse. I can only imagine how disillusioning it must be to have to continue to confront the bureaucrat who asks for a bribe to do his job, or the agency that fails to deliver a basic service, or the politician who breaks yet another campaign promise. Yet, hard as it is, remember what is at stake, not only for yourselves, but for generations of Ukrainians to come. Remember that the yearning to have a voice, which brought so many Ukrainians out to the Maidan and resonated with so many millions more, the cry of hednist, hednist, dignity, dignity, is just as powerful now as it was then. Remember that the alternative to forging ahead is accepting a system in which no one expects you to have a say in your country's future. And remember that big changes in institutions, behaviors, and societies always start with the smallest actions of individuals. Let me give you an example. As many of you know, Kyiv is overhauling its police department. Few institutions have a more abysmal track record. In fact, I would bet that many of you here have had to pay a bribe at one time or another to a police officer in Kyiv. Nor is the problem limited to your city. A government study last year found that only 3% of Ukrainians trusted their police. So the new authorities in Kyiv decided to start from scratch and put out an appeal for new recruits. For 2,000 positions, more than 33,000 people applied. The competition was rigorous, including in-depth interviews, psychological and ethical exams, and other tests. In the time since, the chosen recruits have spent months training with international experts, including law enforcement officers from the United States. They will earn 4 times what police officers in Kyiv used to earn. Not a lavish wage by any measure, but enough that they cannot claim that they are collecting bribes in order to provide for their families' basic needs. In Kyiv's old police, there were almost no female officers. In contrast, a quarter of the new recruits are women, as is the director of the police reform effort. One recruit is a young woman named Anastasia Marchenko. When asked recently by a reporter how she thought women officers would be treated, she said, quote, "In the beginning it will be difficult. Maybe they'll laugh, maybe they won't take us seriously. But I think it will depend on how we handle ourselves," end quote. Asked why she applied, Anastasia said, quote, "I wanted to do my own small part for these reforms. I wanted to try to change something. It's ordinary people who change things in society, end quote. That is what one of the great moral visionaries in my country's history, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, meant when he said, quote, "The most important political office is that of the private citizen," end quote. It is private citizens like Anastasia, who is here with us today, on whom the success of the project that began in the Maidan depends. Citizens like you. And as you assume that most important political office, the office of citizen, you must continue to demand a government that lives up to your country's noblest principles, to ensure that your leaders and fellow citizens listen to what American President Abraham Lincoln once called the better angels of our nature. That means that Ukraine is stronger when it listens to those calling on its military to respect international law while defending its people from attacks by combined Russian separatist forces, even as its enemies ignore those same standards. It means that Ukraine should zealously protect freedom of the press, including for its most outspoken and biased critics, indeed especially for its most outspoken and biased critics, even as the so-called separatists expel journalists from the territory they control, and even as Russia shutters Tatar media outlets in occupied Crimea. It means that politicians and police across the country should recognize how crucial it is that people be able to march to demand respect for LGBT rights and the rights of other vulnerable groups without fear of being attacked. And it means that the Ukrainian government should do everything in its power to get humanitarian aid to the civilians trapped along the line of contact and those struggling to survive in separatist-controlled areas, as well as to ensure the swift freedom of movement across the line for humanitarian actors. It is this idea that the people can use their voice to hold their leaders accountable that is so threatening to leaders like President Putin and the autocratic governments they lead. And it is the reason Moscow is working so desperately to sabotage your efforts at reform. Just look at the contrast. In Ukraine, civil society is the driving force behind the reform agenda. Its leaders are being elected to seats in the Rada and leading key ministries and playing a central role in crafting public policy. In Russia, the government is doing everything it can, from passing repressive legislation to launching violent attacks, to muzzle civil society. Just a few weeks ago, on May 23rd, the Russian government signed a decree targeting what it called undesirable organizations, which lets the government ban the activities of any NGO seen as undermining, in quotes, state security, national defense, or the, quote, constitutional order, end quote. Vague and sweeping, this draconian legislation builds on a 2012 law that requires Russian NGOs receiving foreign funding to register as what it calls foreign agents, demonizing these groups among the public. According to an independent watchdog group, Russia has pursued lawsuits against at least 9 organizations branded as foreign agents, including some of the country's leading human rights organizations. One group identified as a foreign agent and targeted for repression under the new law is Dynasty, an organization that promotes scientific research and education and supports promising young Russian physicists, biologists, and mathematicians. It is bitterly ironic that the Russian government, which views international support for NGOs that promote human rights as an unacceptable threat to its security, it is ironic that that same government has no qualms bankrolling, training, and arming separatist movements in multiple neighboring countries and sending its soldiers across Russia's borders to fight alongside those same fighters. You tell me, which of these is the true foreign agent? Russian NGOs in Russia or Russian soldiers in Ukraine? In Ukraine, the people and the government have pressed relentlessly for the release of Nadia Savchenko, the Ukrainian pilot who was captured in June 2014 by separatists on Ukrainian soil and then smuggled against her will to Russia, where she's been held ever since. In that time, Nadia has endured relentless interrogations and even been subjected to solitary confinement for staging a hunger strike. Just yesterday, her detention was extended yet again by Russian courts until September 30th. Meanwhile, Nadia's 78-year-old mother, Maria, has traveled the world making the case for Russia to release her. I had the opportunity to meet Maria in New York a few months ago, and as a mother myself, I cannot imagine the pain she must feel. But Maria has not given up, and neither has Nadia. Maria is here with us today, and today, Maria, we repeat to you that the United States will continue to press tirelessly for Nadia's release, as well as the release of all Ukrainians who are being held illegally by the so-called separatists and by Russia. Now, while you would be hard-pressed to find a person in Ukraine who has not heard about Nadia's case, the overwhelming majority of Russians have little idea that their soldiers are fighting in eastern Ukraine, where the Russian government continues to deny its involvement. Compare Ukraine's efforts to secure Nadia's release with the Russian government's response to the 2 special operations Russian soldiers captured by the Ukrainian military in Shastya last month. While the Russian soldiers have admitted that they were on a reconnaissance mission when they were caught, Russian officials deny the men are members of the military. Not content with denying their military service in life, Russia is also denying the families of soldiers killed in combat in Ukraine the respect, closure, and social services that they deserve for their loved ones' sacrifice. Just last week, Russia passed a decree classifying deaths of Russian soldiers in special operations in peacetime a state secret. And in those homes where the Cargo 200, as it is called, has arrived, the Russian government's, this is the Russian government's euphemism for the remains of soldiers killed while fighting in its covert conflict. In those homes, silence is the rule, as families fear that they will lose jobs, benefits, and find themselves charged with treason by the very government their sons and daughters died serving. In all of these efforts to hide the truth, the Russian government denies its citizens the knowledge of and a say in a conflict in another sovereign country that their government has been fueling. That is knowledge that the Russian people deserve to have, especially given that in a poll last year, 2/3 of Russians opposed sending troops into Ukraine. In these contrasts, one begins to see why the aspirations of Ukraine's reform movement pose such an existential threat to the Russian model. The choice could not be clearer. A system where leaders serve the people versus a system where leaders think the people serve them. A system that trusts and empowers the people versus a system that fears and represses them. A system of rights versus a system of favors. A system that builds up independent institutions and checks on power versus a system that knocks them down. Let me conclude. The Ukrainian people are one of a kind, but the situation you find yourselves in is not. People around the world find themselves facing similarly daunting obstacles: corrupt politicians, rotten institutions, powerful oligarchs, and even aggressive neighboring countries intent on meddling in their sovereign affairs. And these people are watching you. They learn from your stand on the Maidan, and they are learning from the struggle that you are waging right now to build a democracy from the grassroots up. And all of the autocrats, kleptocrats, oligarchs, and bullying foreign powers out there, they are watching too. And they are so rooting for you to fail. But know this, you are not alone. The United States has been with the Ukrainian people since the first brave protesters went out on the Maidan, and since the first little green men showed up in Crimea and the Donbass. We have never left your side, and we are not going to leave your side now when your hardship is great, your obstacles many, and your path to change long. Because America believes that your struggle has resonance far beyond your sovereign borders, and because we believe that there is no greater cause than the cause of human dignity, no greater call, in fact, than the call of hedonist, hedonist, hedonist. And if the pressure starts to feel overwhelming, consider this. Everyone who has bet against you up until this point has proven wrong. People who thought you would abandon the Maidan if you were threatened and arrested, or cede your ground when you were beaten by mobs and shot at by snipers. People who thought your spirit could be broken by the occupation of Crimea, or who believed that you would not be willing to fight to defend your territory against foreign attackers. People who thought that the severe hardship inflicted by sustained aggression would wear you down. But no, you have definitely not been broken. That tenacity, that willingness to fight for your voice, whether against internal oppressors or outside would-be occupiers, is one of the proudest parts of Ukraine's national heritage. It is in your DNA. It is the legacy of the Ukrainian farmers, shopkeepers, and school principals who risked their lives by violating the central government's orders to hand over their stocks of grain during the Holodomor, choosing to share it instead with hungry neighbors. And it is the legacy of the great Ukrainian dissident poet, Vasyl Stus. His poems were banned by the authorities. His books were methodically tracked down and destroyed, and he spent 23 of his 47 short years in prisons and labor camps, before ultimately dying while on hunger strike in a political prisoner camp in the Urals. Yet throughout his life, Stus refused to be silent, continuing to write and continuing to speak out against the injustices he saw around him, no matter the consequences. And his words are immortal. Here is part of a poem he wrote. You may still be bleeding from pain. You are still torn to pieces, yet you are strong and defiant. You are standing tall for freedom. Ukraine, you may still be bleeding from pain. An aggressive neighbor may be trying to tear your nation to pieces. Yet you, from committed volunteers like Anastasia Marchenko to brave fighters like Nadia Savchenko, from the humanitarian volunteers in Vostok SOS to factory workers in the Avdiivka plant, you are strong and defiant. You, Ukraine, are standing tall for your freedom. And if you stand tall together, no kleptocrat, no oligarch, and no foreign power can stop you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador. У нас лишилося ще
We have a couple of minutes left for a quick Q&A session. You may use the microphones.
questions. We have 2 microphones. Please come towards them and we will be able to take your questions. I will call them out as needed. Якщо ви будете задавати своє питання українською мовою,
If you ask your questions in Ukrainian, will you please allow a second before our colleagues will translate it into English? Thank you.
ми готові з цього кінця. Будь ласка.
My name is Job Drescher. I'm a state philosopher and member of the Basic Income Earth Network.
Голосніше, будь ласка, ближче до мікрофону.
I'm originally from Germany, but live since some years in Ukraine. Actually, I'm more Ukrainian than German. Since the revolution, I'm helping at Euromaidan Press and the Ukrainian Crisis Center with translations into German. My question is, at the G7 summit in Germany, your president Obama said, we stand ready to take further restriction measures in order to increase costs on Russia should its actions so require. I'd like to know in which concrete case this further restriction measures will take effect and which kind of measures are meant.
Thank you, York, for your question and for your work here with the Ukrainian people. Let me first underscore the strength of the G7 statement, which is very important, particularly in light of the fact that the European Council has before it the decision on whether to maintain sanctions, which we fully expect that they will, given that there has not been implementation of the Minsk agreements. I think what's also very important to underscore is that nobody wants to put in place sanctions against Russia. Nobody wants there to be damage to the Russian economy. But those are the consequences. That is the diplomatic and economic isolation that Russia must face in the wake of its aggression up to this point and in the event there is further aggression. So far, it is fair to say that the sanctions have had an extremely significant effect on the Russian ruble, on foreign investment in Russia, on Russia's now shrinking growth. And what we need to do as an international community, as those who pride ourselves on having the pluralism, the checks and balances, the democracies that Ukrainians are working so hard to build for themselves now, what we need to do is to stand firm and maintain that diplomatic and economic isolation, recognizing that sanctions in almost all the historical cases that one can bring to mind always take time. They can have an effect on an economy well in advance of when they have an effect on the political calculus of a particular leader. I saw that firsthand in the Balkans, where I was a journalist back 20 years ago. It just can take time, particularly given the fact that Russian media is not itself conveying to the Russian people what is in fact happening, and given the Russian propaganda, which has so distorted the facts here, and indeed given now the Russian laws that prohibit any discussion of even Russian casualties here in Ukraine. So I'm not going to get into specifics about which measures. We don't want to get to that place. We want Minsk to be implemented, and the path for President Putin and the Russian government is very clear.
Дякуємо. Наступне питання, будь ласка.
Вітаю вас в Україні. Дякую.
We would like to thank you. I would like to thank you for your great interventions at UN Security Council. Madam Ambassador, do you think that Russia will ever lose the power of veto at UN Security Council meetings?
Thank you. I do wish I could veto their veto. I agree with you. That would be my preference. Look, even before the aggression against your country, Russia has been using the veto to very damaging effects in recent years. It has used its veto with regard to Syria now 4 times. And bear in mind that in Syria you have a government that has used sarin gas on a massive scale against its own people, and yet Russia over 4 years has defended that government before the UN Security Council and blocked even joint condemnations of chemical weapons attacks. So the sort of premise of your question, the frustration at the heart of your question is one I very much share. In the case of Ukraine, I think what I would emphasize is the positive, which is my tendency, which is, yes, it's true that Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, which has the veto, is not going to allow the Security Council to condemn Russia. That's true. But there have been other mechanisms that we have drawn upon at the United Nations and well beyond that have held Russia accountable. And I'll just give you 2 important examples, both of which I think you're familiar with, but bear discussion. First, when Russia was on the verge of attempting to annex Crimea using the phony referendum in which the people of Crimea had only 2 choices: become independent and break away from Ukraine, or join Russia. It's not much of a choice, particularly if you're a proud Ukrainian citizen, as so many were. We brought a resolution to the Security Council, and it is very significant that all the countries of the Security Council decided not to side with Russia. Everybody sent a signal. 13 countries voted very clearly for us, affirming Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, not for us, but for the UN Charter. China abstained, which is not a common practice. Normally, these days, for instance, on Syria, China has sided with Russia, but their abstention was a very important signal of the territorial integrity and the sovereignty that were being violated. We went then to the UN General Assembly as well. And in the General Assembly, 100 countries voted to stand with Ukraine and stand with the international order and stand with the rules of the road that would protect Crimea and protect the sovereignty and territorial integrity and independence of this country. And I mentioned the 100 because you can read the resolution, you can think, okay, well, that's just an affirmation of international law, and that's kind of basic. But the effect of that resolution, the effect of 100 countries sticking their heads up and being willing to vote on behalf of Ukrainian sovereignty and against this phony referendum, is that the maps at the United Nations cannot change and will not change. And that's significant. It just reaffirms, it's what we all know. We know, of course, Crimea is part of Ukraine, but the fact that just last year that vote could occur, and so many countries who were intimidated and afraid of what Russia might do next were willing to stick their heads up and either vote for it or abstain. The only countries that voted with Russia were the countries you'd expect, very, very marginal countries with horrible records of abusing and brutalizing their people at home, like Syria, like North Korea. Everybody else, in some sense, was with Ukraine. So I use that as an example of, yes, we can't get out of the Security Council what we need, and the Security Council thus is not living up to its responsibilities because it has given a country that is an aggressor in 2014 and 2015 this privilege of having a veto, but we can work through other mechanisms. And the other mechanism I'd mentioned briefly is the one we were just discussing, which is Western democracies, Europe and the United States, and others who have within our power the ability to stand up for these norms and to put in place measures that definitely take their toll on the Russian economy in the first instance, and over time will take their toll on the Russian calculus. So we need workarounds because of the deformity that you put your finger on, but I think we're finding them.
Thank you. Дякуємо. Наступне питання, будь ласка.
Я Євгеній Олександров, Київ, Україна.
Eugene Alexandrov, Kyiv, Ukraine. East of Ukraine is the focus of attention, but there's yet another problem in Ukraine, the Crimea. Do you think that Ukraine could regain the Crimea in a peaceful manner, and are there any plans considered in the United States?
To return Crimea back to Ukraine, and does any assistance is forthcoming or any efforts is made by the United States? But because it seems that focus now is on the eastern Ukraine and Donbass and the events happening there, but still we are concerned with the Crimea.
Thank you. I can't tell which side. Is it on this?
The right.
It was on this side. Okay. Thank you. First of all, a whole set of sanctions were put in place, sparked by Russia's aggression in Crimea and its attempted occupation of Crimea and attempted annexation of Crimea. Those measures will remain in place for as long as Russia is illegally occupying part of somebody else's country, your country. So that's point one. Point two, one of the things that I do and my colleagues, including Ambassador Pyatt here in Ukraine, do is when we are speaking about Ukraine, we go out of our way to continue to describe what is happening in Crimea. Because, of course, the big violation of international law is the attempt to take Crimea. But every day, the repression and the brutality, as I mentioned in my remarks, the closing down of media, the locking up of individuals who, got used to at least being able to exercise their voice and their freedom of assembly under the government that they lived under for so long. Now suddenly all of that taken away, the harassment and the sense of impunity that the new so-called authorities are experiencing in Crimea. So the United Nations has continued to document conditions in Crimea. We have continued to highlight those conditions. And again, the United States remains committed, even as we focus, of course, on a live conflict in eastern Ukraine, where people are still dying, as I mentioned, and as you know well. We will not ever lose sight of Crimea, and we will not rest until it is back under Ukrainian sovereign government control, which is, of course, where it belongs.
Дякуємо. Next question on the left.
Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Roman Kolody. I am a student of Kyiv Institute of International Relations. First of all, let me thank you for this comprehensive speech. And let me thank you and your country, the United States, for your constant being so supportive of every step that we, Ukrainians, take toward stronger civil society, more effective democratic institutions, and the capability to define the future of our country by ourselves. Therefore, I have two specific questions to you. The first one, we laid great expectations on the United States, the European Union, and the United Nations Organization when the occupation of Crimea began. But when the peninsula was illegally annexed, we hoped that the United States would act forcefully. But sanctions were introduced against those who did not frame the policy of the Kremlin. And finally, when Russia violated everything possible, and we
Романе,
thought...
питання, будь ласка.
Yes, so my question is, what the United States considered to be the red lines for Russia to cross, if not Crimea, if not invasion, if not Debaltseve? And the second question is, as far as we know, the military option is off the table, and the United Nations and the United States will not push the envelope so far. But why doesn't the United States want to compensate it by imposing much more strict sanctions upon Russia as against Iran? Sanctions against Iran were introduced. For instance, we know that those sanctions, including frozen assets and energetic embargoes, made Iranians to get negotiations on track back again, and it proved to be effective. So
Дякуємо,
these two
Романе.
questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I guess I'd say a couple things. I mean, first, right now, we are dedicated, as is the Ukrainian government, to trying to ensure the implementation of the Minsk agreements. These are imperfect agreements, as you all know well, and I know they've been poured over here by Ukrainian civil society, the Ukrainian public, but because they secured the signature of President Putin and President Poroshenko, along, of course, with the French and German leaders, we are still working toward that objective. And we are extremely frustrated, not surprised, mind you, but extremely frustrated by the apparent lack of any good faith in the ways in which these agreements are even being discussed, never mind the lack of implementation. So nonetheless, every day that there is a relative calm or greater calm in the eastern part of the country, and the Minsk agreement has brought about a period of less violence, not no violence, we know, but less violence. That is a day in which Ukrainians here in Kyiv and elsewhere across the country are getting on with the business also of their reform effort and getting on with the business of transforming this country. So I also think it's important, for us to pursue a political agreement and diplomatic resolution to all of this, because the cost of violence and a big spike in violence, the human cost, the financial cost to this country, the diversionary cost, the ways in which, again, would pull even more energy away, those costs are so significant. And so that's, again, why we have always said that we don't see a military solution to this conflict. We also know what President Putin would be prepared to invest militarily, and it would be, potentially, again, bring about heartbreaking consequences for so many families here. So we're invested, we're all in, and the Ukrainian government is moving steadily, again, to meet its side of the bargain, and we are calling out all of the ways in which the separatists and Russia proper are not. On the question of sanctions, in a way, your question harkens back to the first question about the UN Security Council. I mentioned the various ways in which we can work around the UN, Russia's veto on the UN Security Council, but there's no question that the Iran sanctions you reference are as powerful as they are because it is a global regime. Because that sanctions regime was authorized by the UN Security Council, it has a bite and obligates all member states in the international community. Whereas the approach that we have taken working around the Russian veto in the Ukraine case is one where we build a kind of coalition of countries that are prepared to stand up on behalf of the UN Charter, even though Russia has used its veto in this perverse way, and even though Russia is flagrantly violating that very charter. So that is a challenge, but again, I think if you look at the bilateral tools available to us, the issue is not that these sanctions are not doing damage to Russia. And just some facts here, there's been a 40% reduction in the ruble's value. $150 billion of capital flight in 2014 alone. A broad consensus among analysts that Russia will be in recession this year, and extraordinary restraints on growth. So all the predictions that were made a couple years ago, all out the window because of the effect of these sanctions. So the issue, again, is not that the sanctions aren't biting. It is that they have yet to change President Putin's calculus sufficiently, and that's why we have to keep them in place and tighten the screws and make sure that the diplomatic and economic isolation holds, also to give Ukrainians time to continue to build out this very alternative model.
Thank you.
Лишається час ще на одне питання. We have time for one last question here on the right-hand side.
Mrs. Ambassador, my name is Pavlo. I am from Youth Diplomatic Initiative, Ukraine, and I would like to thank you very much for your speech and to say that it is a big honor for me to be here because I read your book about the unquiet American, Richard Holbrooke in the World. It's really great book, and it's really an honor for us to meet with you as a co-editor of this book. And my question is about some words of advice. What kind of advice could you give to Ukraine in this time of crisis? A lot of people are unfortunately, at the same time, they are very motivated, but on the other hand, they are very depressed and they think about their future, what is going on to be, so how this crisis is going on to be in future. Just as from your long life experience as a journalist and diplomat, what kind of advice could you give us? And as a professional diplomat, what could you advise to young faces who are sitting here and who would like to build their diplomatic careers and political careers in the future?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks for all the questions. So first, let me say that I'm a late-blooming diplomat, and if you've had the chance to watch any of the UN Security Council sessions on Ukraine, any of the 33 sessions, you'll know that my strong suit is being undiplomatic. So I don't know if you want advice from me about how to be diplomatic. But what I'll say is just a couple things. I really appreciate the question, in part because, again, it reflects the spirit of what I've encountered here just over the couple days I've been here, of people just wanting to figure out how to make a difference, how to make change, how to do their part, how to change their little slice of the world. I think that from just even the organization that I mentioned, this ad hoc group that's helping now internally displaced people, that was never the plan of this businessman I met yesterday. It was probably the last thing on earth he was thinking about doing. But to hear the pride with which he spoke about the contributions that he was making, to hear him, just a businessman, describe how people find him now on Facebook, and, you know, he feels good. I mean, he's worried, like all of you, but he feels good because he's doing something, and he's helping those people. And as he told their stories, the emotion with which he told the stories of people that a year ago he'd never heard of, he'd had no contact with, you know, not even a friend of a friend of a friend. I mean, just so remote, these connections, and yet that sense of Ukrainian solidarity and just doing something tangible to help people who are directly affected by the ongoing conflict, to help people who've been displaced from Crimea or are still trying to maintain Tatar language newspapers, to do one's part on anti-corruption, even if it means just not paying a bribe, and posting on YouTube a video of you saying, here's what happened to me the other day, and by the way, I was asked to pay a bribe and I chose not to pay a bribe. Or posting, there's a website like this in India called IPaidAbribe.com, and it describes, it literally incriminates officials to whom one has had to pay a bribe, but it has two other sections on the website, which the second section on the website is, I didn't pay a bribe. So basically, they tried to get money out of me and I refused, and people telling that story. And then the third section is, I didn't have to pay a bribe, telling the story of officials who just went about their business, did their job, and didn't think anything about it. And so even small acts like that, just taking seriously that exercise of responsibility inherent in the line I use from Justice Brandeis, the most important political office is that of citizen. I think the people that I've met, what do I know? I've been here 2 days. But the people I've met who have seemed the most upbeat were the people who were engaged, had something to do every day where they felt like they were doing even something very, very small. And then in terms of your question about becoming a diplomat, now everything is for young people, everything is here in Ukraine. You have to deal with corruption issues, you have to deal with, somebody called it today in one of my meetings, political nation building. You have to deal with transitional justice, internally displaced people, there are refugees in neighboring countries. Suddenly you have OSCE and Doctors Without Borders and the International Committee for the Red Cross. You have all these organizations. There are so many opportunities now that young people can have to get exposed to issues. It's not something anybody ever wanted. You never wanted to have OSCE or the International Committee for the Red Cross here in Ukraine because it's a symptom of conflict and of great tension. But now that they're here, supporting those efforts, learning what they do, those are the kinds of things, once Ukraine is on track, the talents of young people here who've helped make this experiment work and this transformation happen, those talents would be extremely valuable, whether in the Ukrainian Foreign Service, Foreign Ministry, or working for the United Nations in Congo, for that matter. So out of this experience, there's going to be tremendous social capital and intellectual capital that can ensure that Ukraine will be an extremely important, not only stakeholder in the international community, but actor in the international community. And that may well start next year because Ukraine is seeking a seat on the UN Security Council. And so, again, thinking about Ukraine taking up that seat, one of only 10 non-permanent seats on the council, showcasing what is being done inside this country, showing, again, compliance with international humanitarian law, bringing to bear the insights that people in this country have on other conflicts and crises, leading. That's what Ukraine can do, and that's what young people and all the people engaged in this transformation can contribute internationally. And with that, I want to thank you. This has been an amazing trip to your country. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Powell.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm sorry not to take all the questions. We're just rushing off to something else, but thank you.